to have hallucinated. And by my theory, only Peter and Paul, well, and Paul, I think, we would all agree. I don't know, maybe you think he saw a bodily Jesus. I'm not sure if you think that he did or not. Paul describes what he saw as visions. So it's very easy to explain that what he saw was in his head, even if God did it, even if God put it in there, that doesn't mean he was physically there. So we're talking about now one person who either is mistaken, and there's plenty of reasons to explain how he might have been mistaken, or we're talking about a guy who gave up his fishing business to follow Jesus and was devastated after this all happened, but used to go around for free and preach to people and they would all be great. And now he can continue this ministry. Like, again, I'm not saying that's what happened. I know you hate that when people don't stick to a theory, but all it means is all you need to do is, if there's a list, as I've discussed, and maybe you disagree, if there's a list of mundane reasons that equally explain what happened, then that historically the mundane solution is going to win as opposed to a miracle, because a miracle requires a lot of evidence to overcome that burden. Would you not agree?
Oh, I definitely don't agree. But let me get into why, though. So when you give a list of 8 different explanations, none of which you commit to, and you say somehow as a group they together explain the facts that we're trying to explain, whereas they don't even work together as a group, that to me is just strong evidence that my explanation is a lot more reasonable.
Well, we're talking about one fact now. So Paul, we're talking like he died, whatever. Like none of these, nothing that I talked about affects Jesus's crucifixion. Nothing. So, and then I totally grant you that Paul thinks he saw something. So we're talking about the middle section, and you haven't really shown to me that 12 people saw him, because all we have is stories that 12 people saw him. We don't have any of the 12 putting up their hand other than Peter to say I did. So now we're talking about one dude.
So based on the same reasons why you accept Paul and Peter and James and Jude, you should accept the 12, because it's the same sources, it's the same source material, and it's accepted by the majority of the scholarship on the issue.
No, I actually don't accept the Gospels. I accept the reason why I think Paul and Peter did was because of the epistles, not because of anything that's written in the Gospels.
I'm talking about the epistles. First Corinthians 15, yeah.
Well, no, but 1 Corinthians 15 is not a claim. It's Paul's just saying this is what people believed. Like help me out with this, Paul. If I say to you that Paul says, here I visited with Peter, I spent 15 days with him and James, and I'm telling you, right, that Jesus appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12, like, you accept the Peter one, but not the 12 one. Why is that? Well, because Paul didn't meet any of the rest of the 12.
Well, he did. He met all of them. Later on, we went back to Jerusalem for the council that we read about in Acts chapter 15. So he did go back. 15 years later, he goes back again. He meets all the disciples, or all the ones that were there in Jerusalem anyhow.
Right, if you're accepting Acts, which I don't.
Well, you used Acts to try to fight against Paul by saying Paul had a vision. You used Acts and the account in Acts of what Paul experienced when he was converted.
Sure, but I use it only because you guys you do accept it, and even Max agrees with.
I didn't bring it up. I wasn't going to use it today, but you brought it in, so I'm gonna use it then.
All right, Kyle, how much time do you have in total? Because I actually wouldn't mind talking about the empty tomb a bit too.
I don't have. I'm just going to let you guys go until you get where you're at a mutual stopping point.
Until I have to go to the bathroom.
You need a break?
An hour and 5 minutes.
No, I'm good.
So are you okay if we shift to so I think our positions are kind of
before we shift, I'd like to share one thing though.
Right?
Sure.
I feel that you're being inconsistent, because you said that we really got Peter or Paul saw a vision, and I'll definitely fight you on that and say that Paul thought he saw the physical risen Jesus. And if we can use Acts, I can make that even stronger. but that's one issue, and I'd love to talk to you about it. But also, you then said Peter's just one guy, just one dude had like this kind of crazy vision. The other guys had sort of mass hysteria, and Peter maybe led them in that.
No, I
but
don't
you
think the other
also
guys saw
said,
anything. I think they ran away.
Well, let me finish this point.
Sorry.
Yeah, let me finish this point if I can, and then I'll totally hear you out. But but then you also said at first, Peter's the only guy, but you also said that you granted James and Jude that they had some sort of vision type experience where they thought they saw Jesus too. So you've given me at least 3 guys. Then later you said there was only 1.
I don't actually think they saw anything. I think they believe. I think they professed they saw something. But
so they at least believed that they saw something.
I don't even know. As I said in my opening statement, either they were lying, or they think that they saw something, and mass hysteria would very easily fit into, why Peter could convince other people that Jesus was alive.
So does mass hysteria usually continue to hold ground in people's lives years down the road while they're being threatened with death?
It does when it gets reinforced, and you brought up. So okay, we'll go there first. So what I know you've talked about, this is good evidence that that they were threatened with death. What are your sources that any of those people either died as martyrs or didn't recant, did recant, could have saved their lives if they could have recanted? What are your sources for that?
So, well, for one, we do have the Book of Acts, right? The Book of Acts is and you said that they weren't trying to record history, but Luke actually says in the beginning of Luke and then in Acts that he's trying to give a careful account. He says in the beginning of Luke that he's talked to eyewitnesses and that he's gathered their accounts to compare them and have a faithful account. I see the look on your face, but I'll just read it to you guys. So in Luke chapter 1, he says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So he's received this from eyewitnesses. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. So at least the claim in Luke, and he writes Acts as well, right? The claim is that he's writing a historically accurate account based on eyewitness testimony and his long following of all of these stories. He then in Acts seems to indicate that he's traveling with Paul when he occasionally is talking about we. So in Acts, we have the story about multiple stories about the persecution, the following of Jewish persecutors, how they followed Paul, how they threatened Peter, said don't speak about the resurrection in the name of Jesus anymore, and they just kept going and going. So that's sure, one source.
But that's, you're talking about Peter and Paul again, and also.
And Stephen, who was martyred.
Stephen wasn't one of the 10 or 12, and
yeah, he was better because he was converted as a result of his vision.
Herod killed.
In your mind vision,
Herod killed one person in Acts. Was it James?
Stephen gets killed. We actually have verification for James and I watched a video you did where you talked about the death of the apostles, and you actually missed some of these earliest sources. You talked about like Thomas. Yeah, for some of the apostles, we don't have great sources on their martyrdoms. We do have really good information about the persecution that just disciples in general were experiencing. In fact, for instance, Paul is taking offerings to the church in Jerusalem of several years down the road, 20 years later, because they've been impoverished by the persecution and things that they've been suffering. So like just things like that, they go, hey,
that's Paul. We have a lot of information about Paul, who wasn't there when Jesus rose.
Well, that's about the 12 who were in, or at least the ones that were in Jerusalem, where Peter started out, and where they all started out. But in 1 Clement, which is written about 97 AD, he writes about those who suffered unto death. He talks about Peter and Paul and implies their martyrdom. We also read about it in Polycarp. Polycarp mentions the suffering of Paul and then includes the rest of the apostles as he talks about their suffering. According to Irenaeus and Tertullian, Clement had actually seen the apostles and fellowshiped with them, particularly Peter. So we have sources that are close to them that talk about their suffering.
But Polycarp doesn't say the 12, right? He just says the disciples.
Polycarp says the rest of the apostles. So the apostles would refer to the 12, and it may include guys like Paul, Barnabas, Luke, possibly.
Right. And why do I think that's important? I guess you know where I'm.
Well, you asked for historical records that confirmed the suffering of the apostles who carried the testimony that they've seen the risen Jesus.
And because you use that as an evidence, right? You use that as an evidence to say, because they would have recanted, or they may have,
it just shows that they really meant it, It shows that they really did believe that they saw Jesus alive after death. They really believed it.
But do we know that any of that happened to them? Like, we just don't have great sources.
We have really good sources. Josephus talks about James, how he was killed, how he was taken up, and they cast him off the temple and they stoned him to death. John likely is a reference to Peter's martyrdom. In John 21, it talks about Jesus is talking to Peter in this passage. Now, you may think John made it all up,
right?
But John if he's making it up, he's making it up based upon Peter's actual crucifixion, because of the way Jesus describes what will happen to Peter in the future.
Well, but again, I don't grant that. It sounds like the stories that happened to Peter were based on the stories of what happened to Peter being, I don't know if you think he was hung upside down and that he was, or crucified, the way Jesus was, and whether Jesus actually visited him and berated him or not. In was it the gospel?
Yeah, I'm just saying in John 21, Jesus gives a statement, is recorded by John as giving a statement to Peter about his death. And it says, Jesus says, John 21:18, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." And then John interprets it, says, "This he said to show him by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, 'Follow me.'" So now, right. As a Christian, I go, Jesus is actually predicting to Peter how he will die so he can prepare himself for it. Maybe as a non-Christian or as a historian, someone might say, okay, well, obviously John knew about the crucifixion of Peter, or however Peter died, stretched out, somehow died for his faith, and then he writes it into the text. Either way, that's historical evidence for Jesus, or for Peter being crucified. Combine that with Acts and the fact that he was warned multiple times, put in prison, beaten, to just stop preaching that Jesus was resurrected. And that means that Peter really meant it. It wasn't just like a psychotic break moment. This was like really convinced, along with many others, that he saw Jesus.
And I think I've granted you kind of that Peter and Paul, the story makes full sense if Peter and Paul, those two guys, believed what they thought they saw. I think, the whole story still works, even if they're mistaken.
Mm-hmm. And I can add to that list James, and I can add to that list John, who in Mark, Jesus, again, he's predicting how they'll die, that they will be baptized with the baptism he's baptized with. They'll drink the cup that he's drinking, and this is speaking of their future demise. Now, you could say Mark fabricated that after the fact, but it means it's after the fact that they actually suffered and died for what they believed.
Well, sure, but I would.
So we have multiple eyewitnesses.
But James and Mark weren't in a position to know whether James and Mark didn't actually see resurrected Jesus. So they were not in.
Well, we don't know what Mark saw. But James and John are the ones I was referring to.
Right. So, and along with that, we actually also have no. So, sure, we know how if we grant how they died, we still don't even know, or do we know? Do we have evidence? That they could have changed their fates if they recanted, or how would we know that? How would we know if they did or didn't recant? Do we know that they had this opportunity?
I think that it's reasonable, and this is, like you said, historians, they work on levels of reasonable things. It's reasonable to believe that they knew, after experiencing various imprisonments and attacks from different people, being followed and tracked down, that they knew that if they would stop preaching this Jesus stuff, that they'd be fine. It was initially primarily Jewish persecution that came upon them. Years down the road, it was primarily Roman persecution that came upon them. And all they had to do was stop preaching this Jesus stuff, and it would have ended. So they knew that. I mean, they weren't dummies.
We know that, though. Do we?
I think we know that in a reasonable sense.
Yeah. we're inferring it, but we don't we can't add. I guess I was just asking if you had any more evidence to add to the case that we know for sure that this was a thing that happened.
I'll reiterate, in Acts, in